The bad news is that we're going to finish the discourse today. Um, so at the end of the class, we'll have a discussion. Whoa. At the end of the class, we'll have a discussion about what y'all want to study next Sunday. Pick it up. So this is class 11 on this discourse. So for those of you that are first timers, you really could come to any class because we always get into some juicy stuff. But there is a theme to the discourse. So we will, I'm going to review what we spoke about last week. I think only you were here last week, Payman, right? Of this group. Oh, and Doctor was here. Okay. It won't hurt you to hear a review. So this discourse has been discussing the Jewish holiday of Purim. I'm gonna grab that for her. Thank you. One of the questions we asked at the beginning of the discourse is that the holiday of Purim has a unique, good morning, has a unique instruction. That is that one is obligated to celebrate on Purim, to feast and become inebriated. For those that don't know what that means, it means to get drunk. To drink so much that you don't know the difference between cursed is Haman, he's the bad guy in the story, and blessed is Mordechai, he's the good guy in the story. Now, we're not condoning drinking a lot of alcohol. There are a lot of different ways to fulfill this obligation. There is also, there were times where at the Farbrengens, the Purim feast of the Rebbe would say, one person should take this responsibility on behalf of everybody else. One year, Rebbe said that he heard that in Brooklyn, they fulfilled this obligation according to the opinions that say you drink a little bit of wine and you fall asleep. So when you're asleep, you're in that state of not knowing. But the Rebbe said, it was the Shabbos after Purim, the Rebbe said somebody should take care of doing it the right way. But we're not going to focus on that discussion today. What we want to focus on is what is the meaning? What's the spiritual meaning behind this instruction? So there's a verse, if you want to follow along, we're going to go from page 67 to 73 just to review, and then we'll close out the discourse. So there's a verse that says, Rananu tzadikim b'Hashem, the righteous should sing joyously to God. Specifically chooses to use the name of God, spelled Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. We know that there are different names of God. Got another copy here, and there's one book, if anybody wants it. We know there are multiple names of God, but primarily there's the name Elokim, which represents God as he is in a state of concealment. And then we have the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, which is the name of God as he is transcendent. Specifically, the Yud and the Hey, is there someone at the door for us? Thank you. Yep. Specifically, the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey is a name that expresses God's, you got the wrong one? You stored on papers there?
Yeah, mine ends at 66.
Oh, well, we're playing with you a little bit. Okay.
It's okay.
You'll listen.
I'll listen. That's right.
Let your soul. Good morning, Claire. Nice to see you. So the Yud and the Hey and the Vav and the Hey of God's name represents a progression. And very briefly, the Yud is the smallest letter. It represents God as he is condensed in full potency. Hey is an expansive letter, and it also goes from top to bottom. So Yud is small, the Hey goes wide, and it goes long. The Vav continues to go long, and the Hey again is expansive. Claire, do you mind grabbing that door, please? Thank you. We know this process from the microcosm, from the human experience. which God is not wisdom, God is not kindness, God transcends all those descriptors, but we use the microcosm, the human experience, to reflect. Good morning. Please have a bagel and a coffee and a seat. We use the microcosm of the person in order for us to be able to relate to some dimension of God. My favorite analogy is the mirror. I actually saw the analogy in a discourse recently, which I was really happy to see because I thought I made it up, which is when you look in a mirror, right, you're not looking at yourself, but you're absolutely looking at yourself, right? There's no blood, there's no brains, there's no emotion in the mirror, but you see the totality of the experience. So when we look at the person, we look at ourselves, we look at our function, we have a mirror of what the spiritual cosmos is, what the divine process is, even if it doesn't look like us at all. So what is the process of the microcosm? What is the process of the olam katan, the small world, the person? That is that we our function, we live in our heads and in our hearts. That's where we live. That's where our consciousness is. We feel and we think. The yud is the initial spark of an idea. Conception. It contains within it all the potency of everything that's going to flow afterwards. That's called chachma. Hey is bina, it's expansive. We take an idea, understanding, we take that idea and we expand it, we develop it. Vav is how that idea goes down from intellect into the space of emotion. And then the second hey is how that initial idea becomes manifest in our actions. Some of this stuff happens instantaneously, which usually is the brain functioning in service of the animal, meaning the human function is to actually be engaged in the thinking process. But when we do something kind of instinctually, the brain is involved in that process, but it's not really functioning in its higher power, in its higher quality. So when we use the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, that is talking about God as he's flowing in the divine structure. Versus Elokim, that's God as he's completely concealed. In other words, we interact with God as, for the most part, as he's Elokim. We don't look at a tree and see God. We see a tree. We don't look at a cup of coffee and see God. We see a cup of coffee. But when we begin to think about it, we comprehend and we understand that God is contained within that. But the inner working of all of existence is the name Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. It's the name of God as he is manifest. That makes sense for the most part? Okay. So when the verse tells us, Rananu tzadikim b'Hashem, the righteous should sing joyously in the name of God, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, we're talking about experiencing God as he's in this higher dimension. And that's a reference to holidays. All of the Jewish festivals celebrate God as he is beyond the scope of our consciousness. For the most part, the holidays were celebrating God as he showed up for us in miraculous ways. So, for example, Sukkot, we celebrate God's protection in the desert. God broke the rules of nature. God didn't show up as Elohim. He showed up as, I'm going to use the Kabbalistic term, Havaya. He showed up as God is within the structure that transcends the physical reality. And that's why there were these miracles. Passover were miracles. Shavuos was a divine revelation at Sinai. Of course, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur are experiences of God as he shows up to us on an essential level. That's why it's a day of atonement. That's why it's a day of judgment, because it transcends what we experience here. It's about the relationship with God that moves beyond our usual experience. Even though Hanukkah and Purim, are not called major holidays, they're considered minor holidays, but nonetheless they're holidays, and they're the ones that stuck to our tradition. And Hanukkah, of course, celebrates miracles. So all of these holidays, even if we're celebrating God in this glorious way of the righteous rejoice in Havaya, in God as he transcends this physical reality. Claire, do you mind grabbing the door? Thank you. We're still experiencing God in some manifest dimension. there's still a description, right? Even if we would recognize that the chachma, the conception of an idea within the human experience is the highest expression of the human, right? There's nothing higher than the nucleus of intellect, because that's the superior quality of the human, is our intellectual capacity. But it still has a descriptor to it. It still has definition to it. It still has boundaries, which is why if you don't grab an idea when it comes at you, you lose it. Right? You're sitting and you're listening to something. That reminds me of something. It's gone. If you don't catch it, it's gone. Why? Because there's a definition to it. There's a boundary to it. And if you don't catch the boundary, if you don't grab onto it, you lose it. So that's all the holidays. Not only that, but what is the main obligation of the holidays in this experience of joy? See those that were here last week, if they remember. How do we celebrate the holiday? What's the primary responsibility of being joyous on the holiday? How do we experience? What's the actions that we take? So it says, Ein simcha ela babasar, ein simcha ela biyayin. There is no joy other than with meat. There's no joy other than with wine. Today is the 12th day of the month of Sivan. So last week on Monday and Tuesday we celebrated the holiday of Shavuot, where we commemorated the revelation at Sinai. There are certain prayers that we recite every day known as the Tachanun prayers. They're prayers of supplication. We ask God for forgiveness. We say those prayers every day except on Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, the new month, and holidays. The tradition is that we don't say those prayers for the first 12 days of the month of Sivan. Why? Because the first day is Rosh Chodesh. It's the day of the new month. The next 3 days are what are known as, then you got the second. Then you have the third, fourth, and fifth, which are days of preparation. They're known as Shleisha Simei Hagbala, the 3 days of preparation, where the Jewish people prepared for the revelation at Sinai. So the second kind of gets swallowed in there. Then you have the 2 days of the holiday, and then you have 5 additional days. So the way it works, the Torah tells us that on the 3 major festivals, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot, we had an obligation to go up to Jerusalem. When we came to Jerusalem, we had an obligation to bring a sacrifice. There's a lot of people coming up to Jerusalem. There's a lot of sacrifices. Even the sacrifices were shared by an expanded family, that's still a lot of work to bring all these sacrifices. So the Torah gives us a total of 7 days to bring these sacrifices. They're known as Yemei HaTashlumin, the day of completion, of making whole. So on Shavuos, you have the 2 days of Shavuos, and then you have the 5 days that follow. This is the fulfillment of the Torah's instruction to be joyous in the holidays. How are you joyous in the holidays? By bringing the sacrifice. Some of the animal was burnt on the altar, some of it was eaten by the priest, and the rest of it was eaten by the donor or their extended family. But it's clear from the Torah that the celebration, the rejoicing of these holidays is through eating this meat, eating this sacrifice. And in a post-temple era, the way we celebrate is through eating meat, not sacrificial meat. I mean, nobody's into that these days, but not sacrificial meat, but, a good brisket, a good ribeye roast, some good tongue, eat some good meat. And the Talmud also says, Ein simcha ela biyayin, that you have to rejoice with wine. So what's the experience? What is the joy? Where is the joy manifest? One more time. Payman, you get the door this time.
Senses.
Say it again.
Senses.
Your body, your physical body is partaking in these celebrations. I'm sorry, your animal soul, but it's also very defined. Good morning. So when we say that, so that's the holidays. So they're very joyous days. They're very powerful days. But even in that celebration, they have a limitation. Because the way to experience it, the way to connect with it, is through very specific, boundaried experiences, meat and wine. Temple era and post-temple era. The bottom line is you have to celebrate these holidays with very boundaried, very specific actions. have a bagel. Purim comes along, and the instruction is one is obligated to celebrate on Purim. Forget about the alcohol piece. So let's just listen to the instruction. One is obligated to celebrate on Purim until they don't know the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai, which means that the celebration is not defined. You enter into a place of not knowing. Knowing means that you're engaging with something on some graspable, if there's such a word, a level that you can grasp. When we say that you celebrate to a state of not knowing, that means you're experiencing this in a transcendent way. So why is it that Purim specifically celebrates in this transcendent way? What is it about this particular holiday? Before I go to 71, I want to explain another principle, which we've discussed here many times, and that is that we relate to each other, for the most part, human relationships, for sure, with the world around us, with your dog or with your cat or with your food or with your work or whatever it is, for sure in those contexts, there's very boundaried, there's very defined relationships. You enter into a partnership with another person, the partner brings a specific quality to the partnership, and you bring a certain quality to the partnership. That's why partners agree to go into partnership with each other. And as long as those pieces are there, the partnership is good. In love relationships, we move beyond, hopefully, we move beyond what are you doing for me and what am I doing for you? It's not a strategic alliance, right? Hopefully not. It goes beyond that. And this idea struck me once. When my wife said to me once, she said, "What do you love about me?" And I realized, when you're younger and in early stages of love, you don't think about these things. Then you move out of those early stages of love and you think to yourself, like, what did attract me to this person? Like, what are their qualities that they have? But then when you get asked that question, you say, what do I love about you? I love you. Of course you're smart. Of course you're beautiful. Of course you're kind. Of course you have. That's not what I love about you, because the next person also has those qualities. You may have, in my eyes, you're more beautiful, you're more smart, you're more kind. And sometimes one could be objective and say, no, that other person is actually smarter. That other person may be prettier, whatever. My case, of course, my case excluded. But what do I love about you? I love you. And it doesn't mean that we always love you. Sometimes, even in marriage, even in a love relationship, there is. You take the kids for carpool, I'll prepare dinner, like there is a strategic alliance. But that's part of the love commitment, is that I've chosen to be connected to you on an essential level, and therefore I'm also going to do these surface things. The surface things aren't the relationship. That's where the relationship lives for the most part. So in our relationship with God, it works the same way. The whole relationship between the Jewish people and God is a love relationship. King Solomon depicts it in Song of Songs as this the maiden and the shepherd and their whole love story. But what's the meaning behind it? The meaning behind it is that in our relationship with God, we do have dimensions of our relationship that live in the surface. I don't mean surface superficial, but surface. You've been instructed, fulfill God's command, right? And when you light Shabbat candles, you access the manifestation of God that shows up in the world through light. And when you wrap tefillin, you're binding yourself with God. And when you kiss the mezuzah, you recognize God as he's manifest in protection, etc., etc. Even when you're studying Torah, you're accessing God's wisdom. It's a dimension of God. It's an intellectual relationship, even if it's a spiritual one. So on the holidays, when we're accessing God as he's manifest in Havaya, he's manifest in these 4 letters of his divine name as he's manifest in the flow of creation, we're connecting to manifestations of God, not to God himself. But then comes along Purim. And Purim, we're connecting with God on a level where we don't know. We don't know distinction. Because at that dimension, it's a level that transcends any expression. And we connected to this on Purim because in the story of Purim, that was our experience. As we discussed earlier in the discourse, the concept of Mesirat Nefesh, self-sacrifice, is super irrational. The idea that a person is given a choice to live in violation of God's instruction, or to die, to be willing to die for the sake of God's name, it makes no sense to die for God's name. It doesn't. There's no rational thinking behind that. Because if I'm dead, I can't do what God wants. So it makes much more sense to violate God's instructions so that I can live. And in fact, except for the 3 major sins, that's actually the Torah's instruction. So if somebody comes to you and puts a gun to your head and says, eat this pork or die, you eat the pork. If somebody says violate the Shabbat or die, you violate the Shabbat. Why? Because, as the Talmud says, it's better to violate one of God's instructions to be alive to fulfill the rest of God's instructions. But when it comes to the 3 big ones, which is murder, which is illicit relationships, or worshiping other gods, then we're instructed to give up our lives. So murder and illicit relationships are for other reasons. We won't focus on that right now. But to give up your life, not to worship another god, doesn't make sense. God won't take it personally. He understands the circumstance. You're being given a choice to give up your life or worship this idol. So I'll worship the idol, but I'll be around to worship God the rest. It's not so personal, right? There's a very interesting story. We're going to enter into the month of Tammuz. And it's actually on the 15th of Sivan, which will be Wednesday. On Wednesday, in the year 1927, the previous Rebbe was arrested. And in the former Soviet Union, he was arrested for his efforts in spreading Judaism. And it came out as a result, through the story, there was a particular purge that took place. You can look this up. During that month of June of 1927, there was a purge where they went out, arrested thousands of people, and murdered them without any kind of tribunal. They just were getting rid of anybody that was a threat to the communist regime. And the previous Rebbe writes about what he heard that night in the prison. But he defied them. He stood up against the communist power and those that arrested him. It's a fascinating story. Finally, he was called. They called him into the office, and they told him to stand, and he refused. Everything about his arrest was to break the communist mentality. They spoke to him in Russian. He spoke to them in Yiddish. He did everything to defy them. So they wanted him to stand, and he refused. So they said, if you don't stand, we'll beat you. So he said, no. So they beat him. And they kept on doing this until they gave up. He broke them. He got beaten, but he broke them. And then they said when a official verdict is being stated, the prisoner needs to stand. He refused. And he said that he saw on the table of the interrogator the verdict document that said death, and there was a red stamp on it that said "niet." So he was sentenced to death. Through a variety of efforts and miracles, he was He was not sentenced to death. And then instead he was sentenced to 10 years exile in Kastarama, which eventually was reduced to 3 years, and eventually he was freed entirely. So within 1 month of his arrest, he was freed entirely. He actually went to the exile and came back shortly afterwards. They came to him, I think it was on a Thursday, to tell him that he was being released to this exile. And they said, you can go home and you can gather your stuff and say goodbye to your family. You got to report to the train station at this and this time. So he said to them, when does the train arrive in Kastarama? So they said it arrives Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon. He says, I'm not going. I'm not going to violate the Shabbos because you guys have a verdict. So they said, if that's the case, you'll have to remain in prison. So he said, okay. And he ended up leaving the prison Sunday morning, taking leave of his family, and then going to Kastarama. So the Rebbe analyzes this story. Now, in Jewish law, I'll give you this is a fascinating Jewish law. We're totally off topic here, but whatever, it's fun. In Jewish law, if a person is in the hospital, hospitals are places of healing, but there's also a lot of diseases that fly around hospitals, right? You don't want to stay in a hospital any longer than you need to. It's actually dangerous to stay in a hospital any longer than you need to. So if a person's in a hospital and Saturday morning they say, okay, we're releasing you, you can drive home on Shabbat so that you're not in the hospital. A woman who's in labor can drive to the hospital on Shabbat, right? Because it's a crisis. But if once her baby's born and the hospital's ready to release her, she can drive home on Shabbat. Why? Because it's dangerous. Staying in this prison was literally life-threatening, far worse than a hospital. Because there's no rule, there's no law. We know that the communist regime was completely immoral. And by Jewish law, he was totally allowed to leave the prison to go home just so he wouldn't be in the prison. And yet he chose to stay in the prison, which in a sense is a violation of Jewish law. You're not allowed to put yourself in danger. So the Rebbe captures the essence of this discourse in his answer. The definition of self-sacrifice is not rational. You're going to tell me, well, you should really worship the idol because this way you can serve God for the rest of your life. But I don't want to be separated from God, not for a second. You're going to give me all these reasons, but I don't want to be disconnected from God. And no matter what rational argument you're going to make to me, it still remains true that I don't want to be disconnected from God. I don't want to do anything that disconnects me from God. So the previous Rebbe's whole life, and particularly in this episode, was one of absolute self-sacrifice. And in a place of self-sacrifice, don't tell me about Jewish law. Don't tell me about anything. None of it holds water. And that's the story of Purim. As we mentioned, at any point in the story, we're taught that if any Jew, as we mentioned early in the Megillah, it says Ish Yehudi. The Jews are called in the Megillah Yehudim, not Ivrim, not Hebrews. They're not called Israelites. They're called Yehudim. Yehudim comes from the word Yehuda or Yoda, which means to acknowledge, to admit, to recognize. That is the core of the Jewish soul that recognizes the truth of God, the oneness of God. And as we mentioned, Mordechai is Ish Yehudi. He's the leader of the generations. He's the officer. He's in charge. As a leader, he's in charge of this dimension of the Jewish soul, and he cultivates it successfully. As it says that from the times of Moses until Mordechai, it says that Mordechai in his generation was as great as Moses was in his generation. Because Moses cultivated faith and Mordechai cultivated faith. And not one Jew during that entire period of time had a momentary thought to disconnect from God, no matter the rational arguments that might have been presented. So what were the Jews demonstrating in the story of Purim? They were demonstrating this relationship with God that transcends emotion, it transcends action, it transcends intellect, it transcends everything. Mesiras nefesh, total self-sacrifice, the actual words Mesiras nefesh means giving over of one's spirit. Giving over their spirit entirely to God. There's nothing else for me except for God. And anything else that tries to get in the way is just not real. It's not substantive. So what's the celebration of Purim? Celebration of Purim is we enter into a state of not knowing. We move to a place where there is no difference between cursed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman, and blessed is Mordechai. I had my drink today already. Now we discussed, so that makes sense so far? In God's essence, there's no difference between Mordechai and Haman. In God's essence, there's no difference between good and evil. That's a very uncomfortable statement to hear. We spoke about this at length last week, and I'll recap the gist of it, and then we'll continue in the discourse. It doesn't mean that God wants evil. Where does evil live, though? Evil doesn't live in God's essence. Evil lives in the absence of God. In the absence of God, that's where evil lives. But it's more than that. What is evil at its core? At its core, evil is God. Ouch. At the core, evil is the essence of God. Why? We take a Hitler, may his name be erased. You take a Stalin, a Lenin, a Pharaoh, or anybody who chooses to perpetrate evil. What do they say to themselves? They don't say, I'm an immoral person, right? They don't say that. They say, I'm doing good for humanity. I'm doing the right thing. Where does a person come off murdering people and justifying that? Where does that come from inside the person? In one word? What is the human experience? Where is it at a core? Ego. Comes from ego. Narcissism, right? What is narcissism? Narcissism is ego on steroids. There's nothing else in the world except for me. You know who says that? The Medrash says. The Medrash says that everybody's obligated to say that the entire world was created for me. Is that an arrogant statement? It could be, depends on how you finish the sentence. If you say the world was created for me and I'm here to indulge myself, yeah, it's an arrogant statement. It's a narcissistic statement. But if you say the whole world was created for me and I was created to serve God, it becomes the most selfless thing. Everything around me is exactly designed for me to be able, I never get tense. I never get stressed out. Why? Because everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. And everything is for me to look at it and say, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? So narcissism or ego is the person saying, no, I'm God. I can do whatever I want. If I think that it's right, therefore it's right. How does a person get an ego? Where do we get our ego from? It says it at the very beginning of the Torah. For man was created in the image of God. Animals don't have ego. Trees don't have ego. Only humans have ego. And that's something that God gave us. It's a gift that God gave us, that we can have a self-awareness. And now we have a choice. Are we going to be like our Creator and do good in the world? Or are we going to be destructive? But the power to do evil comes from God manifesting His essence inside of us to give the human being the consciousness that is godlike. So let's say that again. Of course, we don't mean that evil at its core is God, but the power that evil has, the notion that evil has to perpetrate evil, comes from the ego, which comes from God, which is the greatest manifestation of God in this world. We don't function without it. We're like an animal, maybe a holy animal, but we're like an animal. We're just doing what we're programmed to do, which is why God is also concealed, because in God's concealment, we can think that we're something separate. And yet we say, oh, even though I think I'm something separate, I know that God is real. And therefore, even though I don't see God, I'm going to choose to do what God wants instead of doing what I want. So when we engage in an act of self-sacrifice, we're connecting with God on an essential level, and we're connecting with God not as a charade, not as a cliche that in God there's no difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. But in truth, we're connecting to a dimension of God where evil is not even a word. Good is also not a word. It's all essence. It's all God. It's on an essential level. It's a moment of intimacy with God, where all of the other functions of the relationship they're not here. They're irrelevant. They're so insignificant in the presence of the intimacy. This makes sense? '73. Any questions? Okay. Man, I must have done a really good job explaining that. So now begs the question. The other holidays, which are lesser manifestations, so to speak, as we just discussed, of this relationship with God, excluding Hanukkah, we are not allowed to work. You're not allowed to work on Sukkot. You're not allowed to work on Pesach. You're not allowed to work on Shavuot. But on Purim, you're allowed to work. Wait, if this is this profound, intimate relationship, shouldn't it be even more stringent than the other holidays? So that's a question he asks on page 73. Amnam le'inyan isur asiyas malacha hudafka b'yom tov v'lei b'Purim. Regarding the prohibition of doing work, that is specifically on the holidays, but not on Purim. Purim, you're permitted to work. And as our sages relate, at the end of the Megillah, l'basoif ksiv laseis oisam yemei mishta v'simcha v'lu yom tov lo ksiv. At the end of the Megillah, it says that Mordechai and Esther documented the story so that we will make them days of feasting and joy, feasting and rejoicing. But it doesn't say that they documented the story so that we'll make them into a holiday. Specifically, it doesn't say a holiday. It says days of feasting and rejoicing. Now, the Talmud says that initially, Mordechai and Esther wanted to establish Purim as a holiday with prohibited work and so on and so forth. But at the end, they decided against it, and they did not implement it as a regular holiday, but only as a day of feasting and rejoicing. Why is that so? If, on the one hand, this is a day of profound connection with God's essence that's higher than the other holidays, so then it should be a day that's prohibited in work. 74, va'inyan, ki hi ha-neisenes. The explanation is as follows, that is the very reason. These two principles reinforce each other. Ki ne'inyan iser dasiyas malacha, shu aliyas ha-seichel v'hamidus l'sharshan, shezeu inyan ha-shvisa. What does it mean? Why are we prohibited to do work on the holidays, on Shabbos and the holidays? Why are we prohibited to do work? There's an energy of Shabbos that can only be accessed when we suspend all the output. It's not that God is saying, I want you to suffer a little bit and don't drive your car, don't light fire. It's not the agenda here. The agenda is that Shabbos and Yontif have a profound energy. And if you're engaged in output, you can't access that energy because we generally function in the space of intellect and emotion. So if we're functioning in the space of intellect and emotion, right, try to tap into the energy of Shabbos when you have a cell phone in your pocket. It just doesn't work. There's enough distractions that you can't get your head focused. Shabbos has an energy. Yontif has an energy. And you have to suspend. You got to put yourself in an island so that the energy is available to you, so that you can enter into that experience. There is an energy that takes place on Shabbos and Yontif that we call it an aliyah, like people make aliyah, right? the energy of the world goes up. So we are no longer operating in an intellectual space that's surface. We're not operating in an emotional space that's surface. We've moved into a higher experience. Let's explain it this way. Simple. If you're at a rock concert, you can't really think. Okay? It's very hard to think at a rock concert. You can't plug into emotional connection with another person when your nervous system is activated, because your emotions are completely consumed. So you can't experience the focused emotion when you've got all this stuff going on. So on Shabbos, we are elevated. And because we're elevated, we're able to be removed from the rock concert. We're able to be removed from the activated nervous system to experience God on an intellectual level, to experience God on an emotional level, but a real one. When we engage in work which lives on the lower level, in other words, it lives in that space of intellect and emotion, but not as it's elevated, but as it's mundane, that's like being at a rock concert. And you just can't access the experience. Which, by the way, is an interesting thing that I find fascinating, is that you have people at some point in their life, they are introduced to the real experience of Shabbos and holidays, and suddenly their whole world has changed. And you say, wait, what happened that this Saturday suddenly you feel the energy of Shabbos and last week you didn't? What is it about this holiday that you suddenly experienced? You didn't experience it before. Because until this experience, they were at the rock concert. That's where they hung out on Saturday. They never entered into that place that is Shabbos. They never entered into that space that's holiday. So when you're wrapped up in the experience of the physicality, I don't want to get too far afield with this, but another great metaphor for this, I would say, is intimacy between two people, right? To fully experience intimacy, you have to use your intellect and you have to use your emotion, but you have to separate yourself from intellect and emotion as it lives in the mundane. You have to enter into a different dimension of intellect and emotion. And as long as you're stuck in the mundane, you don't really connect. So even though you're using the same tools, but those tools are living in a very surface place. So that's how it works generally on Shabbos and Yom Tov, Shabbos and the holidays. So in order to experience the Shabbos and the holiday, you have to suspend the mundane intellect and emotion and enter into this higher dimension. And as he says on page 75, Kol ze ein shayach ela beha'ara shebeseder hishalshlus, the shayach shamaylo mat madrega. This whole equation, this whole analysis only works in God's manifestation as it is within the order of creation. In other words, we're talking about degrees, that there's intellect and emotion in the mundane, and there's intellect and emotion on a much higher dimension when we are elevated into the experience of Shabbos and holidays. But again, we're using rational descriptions to talk about boundaries and definitions. So they're not the definitions of the 6 days of the week, they're the definitions of Shabbos. But they're still definitions, which is, by the way, why you need to not do work on Shabbos. Because otherwise you can't experience, when you're trying to access something that has definition, you can only engage with it based on its definition. You can't engage in it unless you're following the parameters that make itself available to be engaged with. ולכן ששת ימים תעשה מלאכה, ואחר כך ביום השביעי, מדרגה נילס הרבה תשבייס, which is why you got to work for 6 days. You got to engage in the mundane, and then only after the 6 days of work, then you could enter in on the 7th day to this loftier space. To rest, to go to be elevated from a lower space to a higher space. And similarly, that's the way it works for all of the festivals, where on the festivals, we also have an increase of divine light, which we need to enter into to experience. And through, therefore, it's appropriate that we are prohibited from engaging in work and resting from labor, which is this external manifestation of our intellect and emotion, so that we enter in to this higher level that gets revealed on Shabbos and holidays. And as we said, this is only an equation that works within the structure of creation. Because there, within the structure of creation, we can talk about higher and lower. We can talk about the holy and the mundane. We can talk about elevation, right? If you're being elevated, it means you're going from one place to a higher place. But that only works when we're talking about descriptors that actually have those parameters around that.
People mistake work for that jazzed up, elevated space. You know, it's easy in some professions to misunderstand and think that work is the highest expression of self, and this is fidelity. So if you've not experienced that essence, where you said that energy, Shabbat, you just don't know it.
Yeah. That's why experiencing Shabbos, right, to actually challenge yourself for one Shabbos, to fully observe the Shabbos, to fully enter into that experience, is giving yourself a gift of experiencing something that you'll never experience unless you choose to enter into it. It doesn't happen on its own. It's not going to consume you. You have to enter into that experience.
How do you do it to enter in the rest? Because our mind was thinking, and you don't want to be alone with yourself, you don't want to rest, you're just thinking, what I'm going to do, especially if you don't have nothing to do. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to rest.
Yeah.
Or how do you go?
So rest is not about sleeping. It's not even about meditating. It's about putting yourself in a container that doesn't have all of that other distraction. Rest is about not engaging in creative activity. It's not very hard to light a match, but you're not allowed to light a match. But if you want to move your couch from one side of the room to the other, you can do that. That's much more difficult. Why? Because it's not creative activity. You're not creating anything. But striking a match is creating something. And what ends up happening is that when you move into that space, you yourself are experiencing the openness of connecting with something that transcends creation. What are you saying? You can't write, exactly, because you're creating. Yeah.
Not gardening is hard. For me.
It says that I think it was the second Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe, it says Shabbos was the hardest day of the week for him because when he would get a new insight, he would immediately write it down. But on Shabbos, he wouldn't be able to. So what does that mean? You have to connect with the idea on a deeper level, which is difficult to do. By the way, and all the traditions associated with Shabbos increase that container, right? When you engage in the spiritual practice of Shabbos, it increases the capacity to access that. But your average Western human who is so engaged in output throughout the week and just shuts that down, try on a Tuesday to turn your cell phone off for 24 hours. Try not to look at your email. It's extremely difficult. But doing it in the context of Shabbos is also difficult, but it gets a new life of its own. And then you become empowered for the whole week that follows to experience the week in a totally different dimension. Because that's the end game. The end game of experiencing Shabbos is that because we become elevated, we're then able to go into the week and look at the mundane through a new set of eyes. It doesn't mean it doesn't challenge us, the mundane, but we're able to refine it a little bit. We're able to look at it a little bit more softly. So that's all as it is in Shabbos and the holidays, because we're accessing God as he's manifest within these parameters of the order of creation. So therefore we need to meet God in that space and we need to have parameters. 77, Avobatzmusi Muhusi is Baruch. She'ena begeder alman klal. But when it comes to God's essence, God's being as it is, blessed be he, which is not defined by any of these parameters. It's not defined by the parameters of worlds, even the highest of worlds. So how can you rest? How can you compel rest, which is defined by boundaries and by levels when there's no boundaries there? You don't need boundaries to connect with God's essence. You need boundaries to connect with God's manifestation. In other words, even at work, God's essence is found there. And because Purim is a day of essence, we can be with God at work too. We can be with God when we're lighting matches and when we're cooking food and when we're doing all this work. God's essence is totally there. If we go back to that energy of, I don't want to be disconnected from God, so then I'm not. I'm not disconnected from God. If that's my consciousness, that I am connected to God on an essential level, so whatever I'm doing is godly. I don't have to struggle with that. That's Purim. Because in that dimension of God, in God's essence, above and below are exactly equal. That physical action in the lowest of the four worlds and God's sublime supernal chachma, his highest level of intellect of the highest of the worlds, they're exactly equal before him. The highest of spiritual revelations and the most mundane of actions are exactly the same before God's essence. There's no distinction between them. The distinction between them is in our consciousness, as it lives in God's manifestation, but in God's essence, there's no distinction between them. That's why Shabbos, it says, it is Shabbos for Havaya. Again, using the same name that we said about holidays, it's a day of rest for or to God as he's manifest within the order of creation, within the spiritual realms. Like we said about holidays, where the righteous rejoice in Havaya. And therefore, Purim, we are permitted to engage in work because there's no distinction there. So this concludes our discourse. So let's talk about the takeaway in a very real way, because it's not Purim today, and it's not Purim every day. But the experience of the holiday of Purim empowers us to recognize what we are at our core. The holiday of Purim empowers us to recognize what we are, who we are at our core, that at our core we are connected to Hashem's essence. And it produces two results. You didn't get the message. Sarah wasn't in touch with you last week. Okay. Give me a few minutes. We decided to reschedule, although we have a nice crowd today, but so at our essence, we are connected to Hashem, even if we don't live in that space. So we are required to live in this tension because we don't live in a space of essence, because then we can't function in a normal way. We have to live in the brain space, in the heart space, because that's where we show up when we do a mitzvah. That's where we show up. If we want to bring God into the mundane, we have to be connected to the mundane. We have to show up at work. We have to use our brain at work. We have to use our heart at work. We have to use our brain and hearts in our relationships. But we have to remember that those dimensions are not essence. And that our ultimate goal is to bring essence into those experiences. So first of all, whenever we have the opportunity, we need to plug into essence on some level. When we pray, we can get a little glimpse of it. We can have a moment where we connect with that. When we do a mitzvah, we have that opportunity, because then we're energized by that essence and we're empowered to be able to engage in the mundane things, in the surface of the relationship, infused with that. Again, I'm going to use intimacy as an example because a relationship, a love relationship, let's use marriage, that doesn't have intimacy, doesn't work. But intimacy is not something that's happening 24/7. You live in the surface. But when you have intimacy, that energizes all of the surface. And if all you do is surface and not intimacy, it doesn't work. Conversely, if a person has only an intimate relationship, that's not a very real relationship, because that's not where relationships live. They live in the surface. They live in the do's and the don'ts. So the other important thing to recognize is that in our moments of challenge, that we don't have to fight. The fight takes place in the intellect and in the emotion. We can choose to fight. But the ultimate goal of the fight is to recognize that we don't need to fight. That we're able to navigate the choices that are in front of us through surrender, through accessing the essence. In the most difficult moments, if we can surrender our thinking and our feeling and say, God, you're with me. I'm with you. What do I need to navigate this challenge? I need you, God. I don't need to think. I don't need to feel. I just need you. Then that becomes the greatest power to be able to move through those challenges. If we choose to engage on an intellectual and emotional level, so then we're navigating. We're fighting with ourselves. We're trying to convince ourselves. We're trying to feel ourselves into an experience. And again, the reality is, even if you take that message to heart, you're not gonna think about that all the time. When you're engaged in the battle, you're engaged in the battle until at some point you say, wait, I don't need to be doing this, because I have a higher power inside of me that can navigate right through this. And you may surrender to that, and it'll help you through that particular challenge until the next challenge comes along. And this is the process of self-discovery, right? As we get to know ourselves, what are my triggers? Where are my emotions formed from? Where's my thinking formed from? So we try to think ourselves out of the situation, try to feel ourselves out of the situation, and sometimes it works. But then when we're hot and heavy in the battle, then we got to say, whoa, I'm not going to pull this off in that space. If I want to navigate this, I've got to surrender to something more essential, something deeper. All right, that closes out our discourse. We'll start fresh something next week. If anybody has a particular preference, I welcome your suggestions. And also those of you that are new today, if you'd like to be added to our texting list, I send a text every Friday. Please put your name and phone number, and we'll add you to it. Any suggestions or thoughts for next week, a new discourse, a new discussion? If not, I'll make something up.
Can you have like a list of top 5 we've voted?
Not offhand, no.